Welcome back to Joe Stunner Boxing. One of my subscribers, Mick Thompson, he asked me if I could do a sort of retrospective on Scott Quigg, who is apparently one of his favourite fighters. Mick says Scott kind of epitomises the sort of English fighting spirit. I enjoyed Scott Quigg's career very much. I would describe him as an overachiever. He was incredibly dedicated. Apparently, when he was a kid, he spoke with a stutter, and boxing gave him some sort of identity, guidance, as it so often does with a lot of kids. And whenever he was interviewed during his career, he would, when he was based in America, for example, he didn't actually get out and see much of the country, or if he was to visit another country, he would stay in his hotel room because he was just totally devoted to being the best fighter he could be. And it resulted in him being a British champ and also a world title belt holder. So his career started in 2007, and he fought the standard sort of journeymen, people like Sid Razak and Delroy Spencer, I think he fought. And, he sort of built his way up fighting journeymen, really, for the first couple of years of his career. I don't think there was anyone with a winning record. I could be wrong about that. I'll have to check. But he gradually sort of edged his way towards title contention, and he won a WBA Intercontinental Super Bantam title, which gets you a ranking, of course. And we always say this about these trinkets: they do get you a ranking. They're not entirely meaningless. And at some point, I think he won a British title eliminator. But he ended up with this WBA trinket. And the British title was also another option. And to his credit, he won the British title. He went down that route, which I've always respected. He beat Jason Booth, another terrific British warrior, English warrior. Stopped him in 7 rounds. I think Jason retired after 7 rounds. Jason, by the way, I should do a video on him because he's got a terrific story. One of where he was flying high and then he became a complete slave to addiction, ended up homeless, and then he went into recovery, resurrected his career, and actually went on to achieve quite a lot. Didn't quite get over the line with the world title, but he won a lot of belts. But that's Jason Booth for you. Let's get back to Scott Quigg. Scott stopped Jason. He was on the downside of his career in 2011 and became British champ. He defended it against Jamie Arthur. He had 2 fights with Rendell Munro. One was a technical draw after 3 rounds. There was a clash of heads and Munro got cut. And I remember thinking, I think Munro can win the return. In actual fact, he got stopped in 6 rounds by Scott, and that was the first time that Scott really made some waves. Because, like I say, prior to that, although he'd won that WBA trinket, he'd been fighting an awful lot of journeymen. And he then won. I've got to try and get this right now. I think a few fights. I know he beat William Prado. That was. I don't know whether that belt was on the line, but he stopped him in 3 rounds. And Prado at the time had a pretty good record, 21-3, I think it was. And Prado was quite. I mean, it was top 15, I think, fighter if memory serves. I should look that up. But anyway, he then had a majority draw with Joandris Salinas, who was undefeated, 20 wins, no defeats and 1 draw. And that was for the WBA World, in other words, the full fat version of the WBA title, the WBA Super Bantam World title, because apparently they have a world title and an interim and oh Christ, it does my head in. Anyway, that was a majority draw. But then in his next fight, Scott took on Diego Oscar Silva for the WBA Super Bantam title. And won it in 2 rounds. He knocked him out in 2 rounds, which again was quite a shock because Silva had a pretty glossy looking record, and again a lot of people picked him to to defeat Scott. These are all in Manchester. Scott's from Bury, I think, but did a lot of fighting in Manchester, which I suppose is the newest big city maybe. He then beat Munyai, Japanese fighter. He stopped him in 2 rounds. That was a defence. He then took on Stefan Jamoy, who was a very good European level fighter, French fighter, and stopped him in 3 rounds. So he was tearing up some trees by this point. These are all, home turf defences. But there was definitely a big build-up to a confrontation between Scott and Carl Frampton. Frampton, IBF champ, initially was joint promoted by Eddie Hearns Matchroom and the McGuigans. But then there was some sort of disagreement and he left, and so Matchroom picked up Scott. So he sort of Matchroom went from one side of that fence to the other and were promoting him. Hidenori Otake was done in... No, I think they went the distance. I think that was a unanimous decision. That was another defence. So he's making all these defences and getting quite well paid for it. And then in 2015... again, this was a defence of the WBA title. He took on Kiko Martinez, who we all know about, and knocked him out in 2 rounds. Now, no one has ever really did that to Martinez. I mean, even when Martinez was fighting people like Carl Frampton, I mean, he got knocked out and he lost twice. Second time by stoppage to Josh Warrington. No one ever sort of splattered him like Scott Quigg did. I think that's probably Scott's best fight, best win. A 2-round stoppage, and Martinez was down twice in the second round. So Scott was really flying, absolutely flying, and many people picked him to defeat Carl Frampton. It was considered a 50-50 fight. In actual fact, his next fight was against Frampton, and he lost a split decision. And I can remember the first 6 rounds I thought Frampton was easily winning, but over the second half of the fight, Quigg crept back into it. And by the end there was some, was it the 10th or 11th round? He actually looked like he had Frampton in some trouble. But he ended up losing a split decision. Now, he suffered a broken jaw in the 4th round of that fight, which proves, to go 8 rounds with a busted jaw and run a very good fighter like Carl Frampton very close, that kind of speaks volumes for Scott Quigg, how he was a dedicated, determined fighter. Again, I always see him as overachieving. He made all those defences of the WBA title. And when the IBF and the WBA was on the line, he had a busted jaw for 8 rounds and he only lost on a split decision. Very, very, tough fighter, this guy. But unfortunately, it has to be said that although he won 3 fights after that, his best days were kind of behind him. I don't know whether the broken jaw had much to do with it, but he was winning. He was still winning fights, against pretty good opposition, at least in terms of statistics. And then he went to America. I'm not sure exactly what his first fight was in America under Freddie Roach. I believe that he actually, it was one of those 3 fights after the Frampton fight where he actually decided he needed, because he was with Joe Gallagher, and he went to America. Maybe he felt he needed to get away, try something new, freshen things up, and they put him in with Oscar Valdez. Valdez at the time was undefeated and would continue to be undefeated for a long time. Valdez was 23 wins, no defeats, no draws, and this was for the WBO featherweight title. So Scott has moved up from super bantam to featherweight. He's taking on an undefeated guy in America. And Valdez in that fight suffered a busted jaw. And to be honest with you, it was never quite the same, thinking back on Valdez's career. Scott did lose quite wide on the cards. I think there was a 118, 110, 117, 111 and something similar, 16, 12, something like that. But I think as well as the busted jaw for Valdez, Scott had a busted nose and also a bad cut in the 5th round. That was from a legal punch. So he was getting beaten up, but it was one of those fights where the scorecards don't really tell the whole story. Every round was a grueling, grinding round. And Scott Quigg, although he lost, that was a unanimous decision. Like I say, it was wide on the cards, but Scott did well in that fight, especially for someone who hadn't long moved up to featherweight and was facing an undefeated guy who was fancied to maybe rule the whole division. But to be honest with you, that was Scott's last hurrah, because I think he had one fight in Boston against Mario Briones, won a 2nd round stoppage. That was in 2018, the same year as the Valdez fight. But then he didn't fight at all in 2019. and he came back for one final paycheck with Gallagher in his corner, and got the crap beaten out of him basically by John O'Carroll, and got stopped in 11 rounds. It could have been stopped sooner. It's a shame, really. It's a shame watching him, because prime Scott Quigg, I think, would have beaten John O'Carroll, but he just had... He was never quite the same after getting that busted jaw in the Frampton fight and the busted nose in the Valdez fight. It seems like all the miles came within a period of maybe sort of 2016 to 2018. Those 2 or 3 years, 16, 17, 18, he probably had... It's like the wear and tear piled upon him. And I do wonder with Scott, because he was so dedicated, whether he kind of overdid it in the gym, lived in the gym too much, didn't allow his body enough time to sort of repair itself, so to speak. Because you do need those downtimes, those breaks, to prolong your career, especially as you get older. So he retired after the John O'Carroll defeat. That was the only stoppage defeat of his career. That was in 2020, March 2020. And since then he's been true to his word. He hasn't come back. But we're talking a guy who was British champ, made some defences. I think he won the Lonsdale belt outright, and made a string of WBA world title defences. Very much, certainly the best fighter to come out of Bury, I would say. I can't think of who am I forgetting. I know there have been some fighters out of Bury. I can't remember offhand. But yeah, for a little guy, 5'8", super bantam, made some money. Seems to have kept hold of it. I kind of put Scott in the same category as Anthony Crolla, who went to world level, competed, won other belts, had some setbacks, but ended up with having had a very, very impressive career. And he can be proud of himself. His family can be proud of him, and I think boxing can be proud of him. So that's Scott Quigg for you. He finished with a record of 35 wins with 26 KOs, high KO percentage, 3 defeats, only one by stoppage, and he had 2 draws on his ledger as well. So yeah, Scott Quigg. What do you think of Scott Quigg? Did you like him? Did you enjoy his career? I enjoyed it. I thought it was good. I like the fact he was completely under the radar, fighting a lot of journeymen, and then gradually built his way into contention, British title contention, won the British title, did it the old-fashioned way, defended it a slew of times, and then when his opportunity came for the world title, even though he had a draw in there, he ended up winning it and making quite a few defences. And again, taking someone as talented as Carl Frampton to a split decision loss with a busted jaw. So, yeah. Anyway, if you've got any comments, leave them below. Thank you for your time as always. Subscribe to the channel if you're new. Please hit the like button as well, and I'll catch you later. And of course, bye for now.